Each and every day, enjoy the Simple Six menu at Subway, an entire made-for-you meal featuring one of six-inch sandwiches like the Italian BMT or Black Forest ham, with any bag of chips and a 21-ounce drink, all for only $6. Subway. Eat fresh.
The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects. The BS Report. The BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report, Wednesday morning here in Southern California. We're going to play overrated, underrated, and properly rated with Grantland Zach Lowe. He wrote about Chris Webber yesterday and today. You know it's mid-September when Zach Lowe is doing a two-part series on Chris Webber. You need the season to start. You need exhibition games or something.
This is a lot of fun for me. I got Eurobasket. I got Eurobasket on in the background, and it's like I can do projects that I just don't have time to do. And, when the madness starts, this is a lot of fun. But yeah, I agree. We need to now begin forward thinking towards the 2014 NBA season.
Yeah, we're basically 6 weeks away right now. I was jealous when I read your Weber thing because, I spent 3 years writing my NBA book. The amount of stuff that was on YouTube, there just wasn't anything. It was very, very limited, and the stuff that was on there was loaded so badly it was really hard to see. So a lot of the research that I did was DVDs that I got from the NBA Entertainment, and now everything's on YouTube. I mean, literally everything. I think almost every relevant playoff game is on there, right? Was there a game that you couldn't find as you were researching this?
There were, and it definitely is relevant playoff games. I wanted to watch Kings Suns from I think 2001, maybe was a first round series. I'd have to go back and check that. Where Weber had a really bad series or a bad shooting series anyway. And I wanted to go back and watch some of those games. I think the Kings won that series 3-1. Yeah, that's what it was. And that was deemed, the YouTube community has probably rightly deemed that not worthy of uploading. So there were a few, but yeah, any big playoff game is on there start to finish.
It's amazing. And what's also amazing is the clarity of the video is pretty good too. Because that was the one thing in 06, 07, 08 with YouTube. Like some of the stuff was so grainy you could barely see it. But anyway, you believe Chris Webber is underrated, and you made the case that he's a Hall of Famer, which I actually agree with. I had him in my top 75, but I think we differ on the ceiling of his career. So make your case for people who haven't read the column yet. He has benchmark numbers that are he's a fascinating case because he's sort of right at the sweet spot of what is a Hall of Famer and what's not a Hall of Famer. Like he has some very interesting benchmark numbers. Like if you really cherry pick stats, there are only like 5 guys who have 17,000 points, 8,000 rebounds, and averaged 4 assists a game. And it's like 4 absolute NBA royalty guys: Bird, Chamberlain, Baylor, and I'm blanking on the 4th guy, and then Weber. So it's like, he has some numbers that are like, even though he barely cracks them, he should get in. But his career was cut short. His peak was cut short by a knee injury. So his counting stats are not, he's in that like 17,000 point area where if you look at the guys around him on the career points leaderboard, above and below, the guys that are in the Hall of Fame all have rings. He obviously doesn't have rings. So he's going to be a very interesting borderline case. But I just think at his peak, he had a claim as the best power forward in the league, if you count Duncan as a center, which I do. It was only a 2-year peak. But when he was he's a little bit older than Dirk and KG, so he sort of peaked before they did. And he was peaking when Karl Malone was going down. So short peak. And it just so he's a borderline case, and I just think if he's borderline, he doesn't have rings. What he does have is a great peak, not a historically MVP level peak, but a great peak was the centerpiece of one of the greatest non-championship teams in league history, and just has a stylistic impact that goes beyond his game. Look, he's a borderline case. I get it. I'm sort of a Weber fanboy, but I would vote for him. I think he's a Hall of Famer. I'm okay with it. If he's one of the best 75 players ever, then he should probably be. And you add in the college and the impact of those 2 Fab Five teams. Now, you made a case I hadn't even thought about. I thought the college would help him because
he was great in those 2 seasons, and those teams were great. And as we've seen with the Fab Five documentary, every time we show it, it gets ratings. So people love that team. But they also, all those wins got vacated, and he caused real problems for that university. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that actually, you might be right. That might hurt his Hall of Fame case. It's possible.
Well, here's the thing that's interesting about not even just the college stuff, but just Weber in general. The gatekeepers of Springfield they're old guys. They're not young. I mean, they're not elderly, but they're like, they're older NBA lifer types, media types. I mean, we don't even know who they are for the most part. I mean, I know who some of them are through reporting this piece, and there's like a distaste among that group for Weber in particular for lots of different reasons. He's not I think he's going to have a very hard time getting in because there's people around the league, even contemporary players I talk to, who just don't like him. Some of it is because of the college stuff. Some of it is because he's seen as a showboat who liked to talk a lot of smack when his teams were doing well and sort of cowered when it really counted. But the older generation, the guys who control the Hall of Fame, he's really unpopular. And that's going to be interesting to see if that's the kind of thing that fades, over time as he becomes sort of a beloved TV broadcaster or whatever. But it's going to be an interesting case.
Well, and that's a good point because the TV broadcasting tends to help. When you stay in the limelight from a media standpoint, people that tends to help your case if you're good, even though it should have nothing to do with how you actually played. You mentioned the distaste. To me, this is one of the big cases against Weber. And again, I think he's a Hall of Famer, but there's players from every generation that just seem to anger the other players. And Elvin Hayes was the all-time example of this. You will not hear one nice thing about Elvin Hayes from anybody who played for him or against him, from anyone from that era. And I think, I don't know if this is official yet, but I think Blake Griffin is headed that way for this generation. There's just certain guys that they're talented, but things they do on the court, things they value, their penchant to be better when they're up by 12 than they are in a 2-point game with a minute left, excuse making, caring more about the flashiness versus the results. Those are all the types of things that seem to anger the other players. And Weber is, as you said, one of the best examples. Somebody that you always hear people will be like, I don't know if I'd want to go to war with that guy. Seems to be the common sentiment, right?
Yeah, I heard a lot of that, and you have to understand, a lot of these guys, Hall of Fame voters, they were around the league in 94, 95, 96, 97 when Weber was seen as a problem child. And I wrote about this today. If you go back and read coverage of the league at that point, it was the NBA is out of control. These players are greedy and selfish. I was reading a Sports Illustrated article that was essentially about Weber and Derek Coleman and Kenny Anderson, where Pat Riley says they are going to bring down the NBA, this new breed of out of control, and all the guys are black. And I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. And I'm not saying Pat Riley meant it that way, but I think there was this broader discomfort with the selfish, entitled, whatever superstar, and Weber was one of those guys. And when Iverson came in, I think that's why Iverson was such a polarizing figure. I mean, he came in and as that sort of storyline was already happening, was already being written before Iverson came into the league, and then he became sort of the poster child for it. And there's a lot of guys that they haven't forgotten the Weber Don Nelson thing and the fact that the Bullets teams were largely disappointing. I think it's less than a 50-50 bet that he gets in.
I think that era started. I've written about it. Most recently in the T-Mac column about it probably started with Shaq. And I think the big thing was that these guys were just all of a sudden making big money right out of the gate. And it's a bad idea to give a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old, all of a sudden the guy's worth $80 million. And I think a lot of guys handled it poorly. And you look at these generations. I was thinking about actually there was a weird story last weekend. I don't know if you saw in the New York Post about some book that's coming out. And in the book, they allege that 3 guys on the 81-82 Knicks fixed games for drug dealers.
Including Michael Ray Richardson, yeah.
Right. And I was thinking, like, what a crazy era that was from 77 to 86. All the guys that either they died because of cocaine, their careers were altered because of cocaine. We'll never know what would have happened because cocaine ruined anything that might have happened. Like somebody like Roy Tarpley, who could have been like one of the best power forwards ever, and who knows?
Sure.
Len Bias, Reggie Lewis, potentially, if you tend to think that he might have had an issue, which a lot of evidence seems that he might have. I don't know. But on down the line, I think every team from the 80s had at least one or two guys whose career was derailed by drugs. So that was that whole generation. Then you look at the Shaq generation, and all these guys who got paid too much money too soon, they never really had to work for that big contract. And I think they developed bad habits. I think Webber's a decent example. Kenny Anderson's a really good example. Glenn Robinson, Penny Hardaway, these guys, they were given too much too soon. And I think it's just really dangerous. And that's probably the best thing the league did these last 12 years was figure out a way to make these guys earn these contracts. So the point is that it was definitely overblown in the 90s. And there did seem to be a subtle racial bent to all the stories. But at the same time, there really was damage. Like Kenny Anderson should have been one of the better point guards ever. He never made it, and there's a lot of guys like that. And I feel like in our generation now, the guys tend to make it. They tend to reach their potential. So you'd have to say it's different now, right?
I mean, I haven't thought about it enough about it. I mean, it is the notion that the guaranteed big money, long-term contracts handed out to rookies, that it was ruining the league and it was ruining young players who weren't ready for it. That was definitely the prevailing line of thinking when all of this was going on. And I think it was it was obviously the driving force behind the rookie scale contracts we have now. I bet if you and I sat here and thought about it for 20 or 30 boring minutes, we could name a lot of veteran guys in the league right now who still have bad habits, who still screw up in all the same ways they always screwed up on and off the court. And, even though they are making mid-level money or mid-level money. So, it's tempting to make that money argument. And there is probably some truth to it. And I do think the rookie contracts obviously give personnel guys a much better sort of look and a longer and affordable look at what guys can do before giving them the big money contract. And even players talk about it, the fact that they're going to keep working after they get the big money or whatever it is. It would be interesting to look at, though.
And, maybe some of that was that era, too, because that was just an era that culturally all of a sudden excess was in, and the hip hop. All the people that took off in hip hop and all of a sudden videos and all the songs were about that. And I think in general, it was just an excessive era. And I don't think it was great to be a 22-year-old NBA player who was all of a sudden making $12 million a year because you felt like you had to kind of live up to the celebrity of what everyone else was doing. I don't think it's a great idea to give people a lot of power over their decisions when they're 20 and 21. And you look at like Webber, who has an unhappy rookie season in Golden State, and he has an opt-out clause, which I think they abolished that rule like a year later. So he has all the power in the situation. He doesn't like his coach. He decides he doesn't like the franchise. He just wants to leave. He wants to get out. So he forces a trade to Washington, and because he wants to play with his buddy Juwan Howard. But they now have to give up 3 first-rounders and Tom Cugliata to get him. So now he's on this team. It's basically just him and Juwan Howard. And Rod Strickland ends up there eventually. But it's this really undermanned, lousy team. They have no first-round picks. So by controlling his own destiny, he screwed up his destiny. And the first 6 of his years of his career were a throwaway. And it was because of that decision.
Look, there's no question that turned out very badly for Golden State and Washington, and both of those fan bases harbor justifiable resentments at Chris Webber. But the flip side is, what if Chris Cohen were a competent owner, capable of running a competent franchise? Would they have been able to keep Chris Webber? Would he have been happy there? Would the environment have been more functional? I think you have to look at the other side of that equation too. And frankly, a lot of the thinking and the coverage around the league back in the 90s was like these coaches and owners lamenting their loss of control over these players. And, remember when, and it's just sort of, it's not a long, complicated line from that thinking to, remember the days of the reserve clause, or we had these guys under control for their entire careers and there was nothing they could do about it. Like, I would read a lot of that coverage and read a lot of those quotes from Pat Riley and Mike Dunleavy Sr. and whoever else it was, and think, if I were a player coming to the league, I would think, no, I'm fighting for every ounce of control over my professional destiny and every piece of agency I can find, because these are the guys listen to what they're saying, and you can envision the kind of league that they want. And it's sort of like, if I were Allen Iverson coming into the league, I'd fight for the cornrows. I'd fight against the dress code. I'd do all of it. Maybe I wouldn't, because I don't have that in my personality, but I can understand why someone would think of the league as sort of an us against them kind of mentality, because that's how a lot of these league higher-ups framed it. But I agree. Look, the truth is always somewhere in the middle. But I think when you start playing, not you, but when people start playing these irresponsible young guys and blah, blah, there's definitely some truth to too much money too soon. But I think you also have to look at the other side. Look, Chris Cohen was an incompetent, horrible owner, one of the worst. You wrote an entire piece about every horrible thing that happened to the Golden State Warriors, many of which happened under his watch. And you have to wonder, if that were a functional franchise, if R.C. Buford were the GM of that franchise and, Peter Holt were the owner, would that have happened?
It's a good point. And I think Nelson was pretty grumpy and set in his ways at that point. And we know he's one of the all-time grumpy coaches, and it was a bad marriage in latter respects. But when you think about fundamentally what he wanted Webber to do, he wanted Webber to play center, but really he wanted him to be a small ball center. And what Nelson wanted to do with that team, A, was a great idea and the right idea, and B, really would have worked. They won 50 games that year. They had Chris Mullin. They had Latrell Sprewell, who was terrific, and I think he might have even made first-team All-NBA that year. They had basically their heart of the team was Webber, Chris Mullin, Billy Owens, and Latrell Sprewell. And then they had Avery Johnson as their point guard, who ended up eventually going to San Antonio and being the finals point guard in '99. The best five guys for them to play would have been Avery Johnson, Webber, and the three perimeter guys. But Webber didn't want to play center. So even though they won 50 games, even though they had Tim Hardaway coming back the next year, so now you have Tim Hardaway, Sprewell, who just made first-team All-NBA, Chris Mullin, Billy Owens, and Chris Webber. That's a possible contender. And Webber didn't want to be there. He didn't want to play in that team. So they ended up making that trade, and everything got shot to hell. But to me, that's a big what if, because you think about how much fun Webber had on that Sacramento team and how much fun we had watching them. I think we would have just as much fun watching that Warriors team, right?
Yeah. And somewhere along the line, I think that the desire to have a true center in all of this, I believe they traded Billy Owens for Ronnie Cycli. Maybe shortly before they traded Webber, or before, I can't remember the order of events.
It was before. They did it because Webber wanted a real center.
They wanted to appease Webber, so they made that trade. No, it would have been Webber's whole entire early career is what ifs. And the best one about it is, what if Orlando had just kept him? Can you imagine a Shaq, Chris Webber front line? That could have been the best two-man front line maybe ever. And I understand the reasons for going the Penny Hardaway and trying to recreate Magic Kareem, and you get 3 draft picks. But the what ifs start there. That was an enormous opportunity for Orlando.
They made that Billy Owens trade on November 2nd of that season, so it was like a week or two before they traded Webber, because I think he was holding out. I had that Webber what if as in like the top 15 in the what if chapter of my book, because first of all, when they traded Webber, it was, I think, that might have been the most jaw-dropping NBA draft trade ever. I remember being flabbergasted because they got Webber and everybody's reaction was, "Oh my God, we're done. This is a disaster." Because Webber of that decade, I think Webber, Shaq, and Tim Duncan were the 3 can't-miss guys of that decade, right? Just going into the draft, Webber had every single asset you'd ever want from a power forward. And he was really good in college, and it just seemed like, oh my God, this is absolutely one of the most unfair things that's ever happened. This is like a Mikhail and Parrish on steroids, or Samson Olajuwon. And then Penny Hardaway had this workout for Orlando, and they freaked out, and they decided to make a trade that, if you were going to judge the trade 2 years later, they got Penny Hardaway, who made first team All-NBA, I think, in 95, and 3 first-round picks for Weber. That seemed like a great trade 2 years later. I still don't like the idea of breaking up a Shaq-Weber combo. And I think his whole career is completely different if that happens. And on top of it, he was kind of better as a second banana. I think him and Shaq, I think they would have meshed well, and you would have had Weber on the high post, Shaq in the low post, and nobody would have gotten a layup off those guys. Like, I don't know. It's too bad.
It would have been interesting because Weber in his prime, obviously in Sacramento, they didn't have, he was the low post guy. They would post Divac now and then. They would post Weber now and then, but mostly they would have each of them working from the elbows. So he didn't have, there was no one down in the lane who was the number one option clogging the lane like Shaq would have been. And Weber, as good of a jump shooter as he was mediocre as a jump shooter. He was not someone who was going to space the floor like KG or Dirk. So they would have had to overcome some things, but the raw talent was just enormous. And it's funny, you look back at that trade, the Orlando fans at their draft event were booing when it was announced, and like you would read these quotes from Pat Williams and the other Orlando higher ups, like basically begging them, like, "Oh, give us a chance. You're going to love this Penny Hardaway guy. It's going to be great. Stop booing. Please don't boo Penny. It's going to be awesome." And I had forgotten. You knew it right off the top of your head. I had forgotten that Penny basically campaigned for Orlando to draft him, and that workout that you mentioned was basically like he begged them to come back for a second workout. Like, it might have been the night before the draft or something like that. It was a crazy story. And they were like, "Sure, come on in." And that was the workout that changed, what their decision was.
One of the many frustrating things about Weber's game, and we talk about the low post, high post thing, he couldn't shoot free throws for the first half of his career. He was basically, I'm looking at it right now. He was in the 50s. In 99, in the strike year, he shot 45% from the free throw line. But there was a little Antoine Walker-itis with him, where he actually would have been happier in the high post, because in the low post, then he might get fouled. Like, he was one of those guys, he always shot too many jump shots. That first half of his career was frustrating. And I felt like partly because he didn't want to get fouled. You look at really never more than 4 free throws a game, which is crazy when you think about the skills that he had. Because he had every single skill. I can't think of one thing that he couldn't do other than shoot free throws. Even on the low post, like, he could score with either hand. He could shoot a fall away. He could had the jump hooks, obviously. And then finally he goes to Sacramento and just puts it all together. But I thought you were too easy on his first 5 years in yesterday's column. You addressed it today in today's column, but the throwing away those first 5 years of his career is really tough for the Hall of Fame case.
I did that in part because the Hall of Fame case is going to focus on the Kings, because the Hall of Fame voters, they care about how you did in the playoffs. What did you do in big moments? They're going to look to those Kings games more than anything else. And the second thing is, like, look, we talk about he threw away all those years. He averaged 20. I'm looking at 96. Oh, he only played 15 games then, so scratch that. But he was 20-10 in 97, 20-9.6 in 95, 18-9 in his rookie year in only 32 minutes a game, which apparently drove him crazy. He didn't play more. It's not like these are lost seasons. Obviously there were off-court issues and on-court clashes and all that stuff, but it's not like he's a flop. You look at guys who come in the league now, they're a rookie. Like Anthony Davis as a rookie wasn't as good as Weber was, and it's not particularly close.
Yeah, but I was going to some of those games. Those are pretty hollow stats. If you're playing, like Sharif Abdul-Rahim averaged 20-10 one year,
That's true.
The teams wasn't really winning. His demeanor was horrible. And that was the one thing that really changed, I thought, in Sacramento. You watched Weber play, and we're going to have House come on after you, because House was stuck with him in Washington. And House is the opposite from you. He's irrational Chris Webber hatred from watching those Bullets games. But his demeanor was like really angry and weird, and he was a terrible teammate in those Washington years. He was not a leader in any way. This is a case where I think the stats are a little deceiving. What's weird is he went to Sacramento, and that team had some of the best chemistry of any team the last 20 years, and his demeanor totally changed. He loved playing with that team. They took advantage of his passing. And all of a sudden it was this glorious thing. And what's funny is it happened during that strike season. So we didn't have basketball at all. That sneaky, terrible trade happened, Mitch Richmond for Weber. All of a sudden he's on this weird team. White Chocolate's on it. Vlade's on it. Nobody knows.
Don't forget Otis Thorpe, by the way.
Well, was he on that team?
No, he was in that trade. I believe it was Mitch Richmond and Otis Thorpe for
Lord,
Weber, wasn't it?
Otis Thorpe he's like the Zelig of terrible NBA trades.
Yeah, it was Mitch Richmond and Otis Thorpe for Chris Webber, yeah.
Oh my God.
And he's in the Drexler trade as well, right?
He was in the Drexler trade, and he was most famously in remember the Grizzlies traded they traded like a first round pick 7 years later for Otis Thorpe.
That's right.
And the pick turned out it was one away from being LeBron. Oh no, they would have kept it if it was LeBron, but it ended up being number 2 and it ended up being Darko.
It's Darko. Yeah, I'm looking at it now. Yeah. So anyway, they made the crappy. Washington sold Lowe on C-Web.
By the way, that doesn't help his Hall of Fame case. That right in the sweet spot of his career, he got traded for past his prime Mitch Richmond and Otis Thorpe. Not great.
It does not. But again, I mean, we're talking about a guy who was perceived very differently than he is now. And, there's some luck. There's a lot of luck involved. I mean, if you're not one of the top 5 guys in the league, and I think Weber sniffed that territory for a couple of years in his prime, but there's a lot of luck in sort of what contexts you end up in. And he just ended up on a Sacramento team that had shooters. I mean, eventually, its early teams were not great shooting teams, but they had shooters. They had a point guard in Mike Bibby who was not sort of like a Steve Nash style, Chris Paul style ball dominator. They had another great passing big man in Vlade, who I think is actually. I was convinced watching all these games that Vlade is historically underrated, and it was the perfect set of teammates for him. And it's like I mentioned Elton Brand in the Weber column and how their numbers are like eerily comparable, and people like scoff at Elton Brand. It's like he's completely dismissed as like he's not even. You shouldn't even. His name should not come up in the same paragraph as Hall of Fame. And I don't think he should get in, and I don't think he will. But it's like people won't want to think about it because he's been on bad teams for most of his career. And they're like, is that his fault? Whose fault is that? He's sort of like a much better Sharif Abdur-Rahim, I guess, in that sense. And there's just, if you're not one of the top 5 or 10 guys, it's just, the context that you get put in, there's just so much luck involved, and all of a sudden your career's over.
Elton had one great year in the 06 Clips. He's probably like the 7th best player in the league that year. And he was like 24 and 11 a night and was just money and was great. And I don't know why that was the only year when that happened. But so here's the case for Weber. The 5-year stretch you mentioned, the first 5 years in Sacramento, he played 308 games out of a possible 410. So 75% of the games. Is that right? Yeah. 24 points, 10.9 rebounds, 4.7 assists, 48% shooting. And his PRE was always like in the 22 to 24 range. He made 4 straight All-Star teams, which has to be taken seriously, especially in a conference with Duncan and Garnett.
Five total All-Stars, which again is right in that sweet spot where like some guys get in and a lot of guys don't. It's like right in that.
You need at least 5. I think Reggie Miller had 5. So anyway, 2nd team All-NBA 99, 3rd team in 00, 1st team in 01, which is no small feat because you had Duncan and Garnett in the league that year. 2nd team in 02, 2nd team in 03. That's a really nice 5-year stretch.
Yeah, I think that's where he separates himself from Brand. I was talking to somebody about this today. It's like one thing I left out in that Brand Weber comparison is that Brand has 2 All-Star games and only 1 appearance on any of the All-NBA teams. And the voters look very carefully at that stuff. If 5 All-NBA teams, 5 All-Stars, you're in the conversation at a different level.
So if you look at most valuable player voting, which I think is, even though every year we have problems with some of the choices people make, but I think it's a really nice kind of snapshot of what happened that season for the most part. Weber finished 4th in 01. Iverson was 1st. Duncan was second. Shaq was third, averaging 28.7, 12.7. And then Weber was fourth ahead of Garnett. And T-Mac had that first monster Orlando year, too. That's pretty good, too. You got to hand it to C-Web for that. And then the ultimate case, if like 5 different things happen in that 0-2 Lakers series, C-Web wins the title, and then we're not even having this podcast.
Well, and then that's what it took us half an hour to get there. But I mean, that's look, we can disagree or agree on the level of incompetence of the officiating in Game 6, and I think they were incompetent, but I don't think they were conspiratorially incompetent. But again, that they should. Let's put it bluntly. That team should have won the championship. And you can say that about a lot of different teams, but it's usually like someone got hurt or whatever. I mean, no, that Kings team should have won the title in like the most literal sense possible. And if they did, then Weber is getting in, because as I told you, you look at the career stats, the guys around him who are in the Hall of Fame have rings, and there are a lot of guys right around him who are never going to sniff the Hall of Fame because they don't have rings, and their career stats are just sort of in that nether world of like, if you're Jerry Stackhouse, you're not getting in. If you're Sprewell, has 16,700 points, no chance to get in. Jack Sikma, not getting in. Now, he may have a ring, actually, so I should take that back. But with that Sonics team. But, there are others who are in around that scoring range that are just.
That's an example of somebody that. He never got past the second round except for that one time with Orlando. And that's true. The Toronto team lost in the second round. But Vince is actually, and look, now we're going down the Hall of Fame rabbit hole, but Vince has 22,000 points. I know. He's probably going to make it.
Everyone above, this is what I'm telling you, people who think he has no chance to make the Hall of Fame. Everyone at that level is in the Hall of Fame or is a cinch to get there. I mean, literally everyone. Iverson has 24,000 points in an MVP. He's getting in. Vince Carter is going to get in. It's going to take him a while because the old guard has that sort of same discontent with Vince as a player and the lack of playoff success and the individual lack of playoff success. But Vince is getting into the Hall of Fame. Be prepared.
Well, the Vince situation is worse because he actually quit on a team. And C-Web, you can quibble about what happened in Washington, but he never actually threw his performance to try to get traded, which I saw firsthand with my own eyes. I went to a Clipper game, and Vince Carter really willfully mailed in the game for like 3.5 quarters and then tried the last 6 minutes. But I know what I saw. And it wasn't an isolated incident. This is what he was doing until they traded him. So I don't know if he lives that one down. What'll be interesting is T-Mac's another example. I think T-Mac makes it. C-Web, T-Mac, and Vince, all of them are going to be really good debates. And I wouldn't be surprised if all 3 didn't make it. I wouldn't be surprised if all 3 made it. I think they're right on the cusp. I think Vince has the worst chance, though, wouldn't you say?
Oh, wow, that's tough because the Toronto thing, and Vince, I think, has even essentially admitted that he tanked on Toronto.
He did. He's on the record.
Yeah,
he went on the record.
Shied away from it, which is, to his credit, but the whole thing is so shameful that to this day, if you read anything positive about Vince Carter, Toronto fans will just flood your inbox with hate, justifiably. I just think the raw numbers are going to be such that they're just not going to be able to keep him out. It might take 4 or 5 ballots or whatever the maximum number you can stay on until you have to take a respite from being a real candidate. But he's going to get in.
The other problem with Weber is just how many games he missed. I have this written down.
Huge.
He during his prime, 94 to 2004, he played 70 games or fewer in 9 different seasons. He missed 283 of a possible 850 games. And that the last injury he had wasn't his fault because that could happen to anybody. But he just wasn't somebody who played 82 games. Every year he was going to miss 12 to 20 depending on what the injury was. And I think that counts. But, we talked about the 0-2 Kings and how close they were. I'm going to go the other way. They had 2 chances to win Game 7, and the 2 guys who took basically make or break shots for them were Doug Christie and Page, who had deer in the headlights, who just wasn't ready for the moment yet. And that was the Achilles heel of that team, right? Like if your season is resting in the hand of those two guys shooting threes at that point in their careers, I'm not sure you should win the finals. What do you say to that?
They were open. If they're open, you got to shoot. I mean, that's, we want to live in this world where you just force. What's the alternative? You force Mike Bibby into a pick and roll or an isolation. Mike Bibby took plenty of shots done.
I'm not quibbling with the shots. I'm just saying, really, that was a microcosm of their team, right? Ultimately, if Bibby and Chris Webber or whatever, you need more than two guys to come through. And those were the two guys that took the shots. Like, look at 2013 Miami. Their make-or-break shot of their entire season was taken by Ray Allen, one of the great three-point shooters of all time. And he made it, and they ended up winning the title. Sacramento had Doug Christie. So maybe you could say that's one of the reasons they didn't win the title.
Yeah. I mean, and the other part of that question is that, Robert Horry was guarding Chris Webber and had essentially no chance to guard Chris Webber on the block. Whenever the Kings would go to him, at least 50% of the time, very good things would happen for them. And it wasn't seen as a realistic option for them at some parts of crunch time. Some parts they did go to it. Sometimes they didn't.
I thought you were too kind to see Webb on the crunch time thing. Because I know there's evidence. I know, he shot 9 field goals in this game or whatever. But that's one of the things. Sometimes I don't trust my memory of stuff. But, man, in the moment watching that, I just felt like it was hot potato with him in the last couple minutes. It was one of the all-time hot potatoes. He didn't want any part of those shots. And if he took them, it was almost begrudgingly. And if Bibby kind of put on like a pseudo John Stockton, don't worry guys, I got this kind of crunch time persona that he took over for those couple of years. And then it just went away mysteriously. But Bibby was the guy who I thought took a lot of the big shots for that team.
He did. It is funny to just watch the mentality of guys. I mean, Bibby and Bobby Jackson were just perpetually fearless. It didn't matter, situation, whatever. Bobby Jackson is going hard to the rim or taking jump shot, whatever. They were perpetually fearless. Webber, look, I had the same memory of you. My memory of Webber in Game 7 of that series was catches the ball at the elbow, doesn't even look at the rim, immediately hands it off to Bibby or Page or whatever cutter is going around, doesn't even look at the basket. That was my memory. Frozen in time was and he took 9 shots. Some of them are bad jump shots that you can tell he feels like I have to shoot. I can't not shoot on every possession.
The Lakers begged him to shoot those. Yeah, the Lakers were dying for him to shoot all of those.
And some of them were he had this habit of, he was a very good off the dribble player from the elbow, and he could pump and drive and all of that. And the interesting thing about Webber, actually watching him, great athlete, obviously, was never a great above the rim player. He would go in the lane and you think, oh, here comes a monster dunk from Chris Webber because he's such a great athlete. And he didn't jump very high. He would have these sort of floater layups or soft touch off the glass layups. And he knew I'm not going to be able to do that against Shaq. That's not going to work. So he would jump a foot earlier, get in the air and sort of have this, holy shit, now I'm in trouble. Is anyone open on the perimeter? Oh no, I have to loft up this layup that has no chance of going in. He was, for a guy that we consider a great athlete, he was not an aggressive finisher at the rim. And I think some of that is he just didn't jump very high. And some of that, and you talked about this earlier, he knew he was a bad foul shooter. He did not want to go to the line. It absolutely affected the way he approached crunch time. And it absolutely affected the way Rick Adelman approached crunch time.
And, the other part of that is at Michigan, he was that kind of athlete. And I think he got hurt his second year in Washington and was never really totally the same physically. And then it was one injury after another. But, man, you watch some of those Fab Five games, and he was the guy you were talking about. So I wrote this, but I think if you just if you had a computer play his career 100 times, I know there's no way to do that, but if you just simulated what Chris Webber's career could have been, should have been, whatever, if you did it 100 times, the outcome that we ended up with was probably in the bottom 20% of what it could have been. And it's for a lot of reasons that wasn't his fault.
if only because of the knee injury when he was either 29 or 30. I mean, he would have had, if he could have been 2002, 2001 Chris Webber for 2 to 3 more seasons, I don't have to write a piece arguing he should be on the Hall of Fame. He has 20,000 plus points. He's a no-brainer candidate.
Or what if Orlando doesn't have the balls to trade him? What if he's just on Orlando for 3 years? Those 3 years, and he's with Shaq, and it's great, and you just go from there. Or what if, what if he never forces his way to Golden State? Like, I just think he's the ultimate what if guy. And in a weird way, to bring everything full circle, I think he's overrated. That would be my final verdict. But I also think he's weirdly underrated because I still feel like he brought the most to the table from a talent standpoint of any power forward I've ever seen. And that includes Duncan, who I think is the best power forward, hands down. Nobody comes close.
Tim Duncan is a center, by the way.
I know he's a center, but I still think he's a power forward. You're right, he is a center.
That's right. We were going to play overrated and underrated. I don't know if there were other players we were going to do that with, but I think Webber is actually properly rated. And the reason I would say, well, here's the reason I would say that. The ESPN Twitter account, which has like 7 gazillion followers, tweeted my piece yesterday. It's like, does Chris Webber belong in the Hall of Fame? Zach Lowe, NBA, says yes. And when a Twitter account with 7 million followers tweets your piece, you are guaranteed to get like a flood of feedback that sort of represents a cross section of the world, right? And that feedback was like, it almost all of it was no way in hell and just profane things about Chris Webber. And then like, no, absolute no-brainer. Of course he belongs in. And it was like probably 50-50. And to me, that's like, okay, that he's properly rated. I mean, if he's somewhere in the middle of those things, he's a divisive player. I think he's about properly rated.
It's funny. I had the same thing happen when I wrote the T-Mac thing. And in that case, it wasn't 50-50. It was like 90-10, people being glad that somebody said T-Mac was underrated and that was screwed by his bad teammates and all that stuff. But you could also swing that T-Mac argument the same way we did with Webber and, was his own worst enemy a lot of times and stuff like that.
The one thing we didn't mention and that those Twitter comments really brought out is a lot of the no way in hell does he belong in the Hall of Fame tweets brought up the timeout. And just sort of the enduring legacy of that timeout plus his like so crunch time play in the NBA. That timeout is 20 years old, and it's still for a lot of people defines what Chris Webber is as a player.
Well, and on top of that, I think it affected him in crunch time. I mean, I really do think there were scars, and obviously I've gotten to know Jalen over the last year or so, and we've spent time talking about Chris, and I would use the word estranged as to describe their relationship over these last few years. But Jalen really believes, and he said this on the podcast with Jacoby, that one of the reasons C-Web has distanced himself from those Michigan guys is because of the timeout and how traumatic that was for him. And he just wants to move on and ahead and away from it, and he doesn't want to relive that era anymore. I do think there were real scars and lingering effects from that, and he spent the next 20 years having people yell timeout at him. And the shame of it is he was great in those 2002 Laker games. I mean, of that 3-year stretch when people went against the Lakers, when really Shaq and Kobe should have cruised to the title every year, no matter how much dissension they had, the Kings came the closest under the Portland in 0-0 came close, really because the Lakers hadn't been there before and they just almost self-destructed and figured it out. But the Kings actually really almost beat them. And you could say outplayed them. And if you watch those games pretty carefully, they're fascinating to rewatch. Yeah. The Lakers were really lucky, and they easily could have lost 6 of those 7 games. The Robert Horry game 4-3 in particular, it's crazy that the Kings didn't get either of those rebounds. It's a little like the Spurs Heat game 6, where you watch it and you go, oh my God, how did they not get the rebound? All their guys are near the rim. How did they not get the rebound? But it just bounced away. It was unlucky.
And what's more amazing about that is that the year before the Lakers, that 2001 Lakers team is an all-time great team. They lost 1 playoff game. The Kings in 2001 won 55 games and the Lakers swept them like they were a D-League team. It was like not quite that dramatic, but it was like the Lakers in 2001 were untouchable, and a year later, the Kings, essentially the same team, minor changes here or there, were probably head-to-head better than the Lakers and should have won the series, and then, of course, would have curb-stomped the Nets in the finals. But, here we are still talking about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk about greatest postseason teams, that 0-1 Lakers team, especially what they did to the Kings in that series, is about as well as basketball could be played. And I think what's interesting is that each game, Kobe or Shaq had a phenomenal game. I think Kobe had the 48.15 rebound in one of those games. But hey, look, that's basketball. Sacramento came damn close. I would say in the last 25 years, the 2012 Spurs came the closest. The 88 Pistons came the second closest. And then it's between the 2000 Blazers and the 2002 Kings. But I think the 2002 Kings were better than the 2000 Blazers. And they
had been together longer.
And they self-destructed less than the Blazers did. Like, if you watch that Blazers Game 7, they just fall apart offensively for an entire quarter. It just, everything unravels on them. And the Kings, Weber does a little hot potato and stuff like that, but they really, they traded haymakers with the Lakers in that playoff series. The one thing you didn't mention in your column, though, and it's not Weber's fault, but it has to be mentioned, he got that extension with the Kings, and it really literally almost killed basketball in Sacramento, that last extension he got. Right?
Yeah, they had to trade him midway through, and they got very not good return.
It might have been the all-time worst contract given out that couldn't be amnestied, because just to get rid of it, they had to take on Kenny Thomas and a couple other
legendary Kenny Thomas contract.
Yeah, remember they had to take on like $15 million a year of bad contracts to get rid of the C-Web contract, and it just spiraled out of control. Anyway, Zach Lowe, good work on C-Web. I enjoyed it. And now, when do we start thinking basketball here?
Well, I think about basketball all the time.
I mean, the season, though. When do we start? When do we get in that mode? Are we like a week away? Media day? When do I start getting excited?
We're there. I think we're there. I think we got to start getting there. And I know that there are some preview projects in the works and all that. So it never really escapes. It never really escapes your mind. But it's about time. It's about that time, and we got to start thinking about how the new rosters look, and who's likely to be traded, and what everyone's cap situation is. I mean, you never really stop thinking about that, but you do have opportunities to take breaks from it. But now we're 6 weeks away from opening day.
Zach Lowe, we'll talk to you before the season starts. Obviously, take
Sounds
care of
good.
yourself. All right, bye bye. All right, we're gonna call Joe House to get his take. We have to get a take from one disgruntled fan who's rooted for Chris Webber over the years. But before we do that, here's something that will make you gruntled. That's right, Stamps.com. I hate going to the post office. The post office makes me disgruntled. Now I don't go to the post office anymore. I just print out my own stamps. Stamps.com is like having your own post office, your own personal post office. Just go there. You can sign up. Little free trial you can get. You can put the BS and the microphone in the top. You get a whole bunch of stuff. Get some deals. You get a scaler. You get money off postage. Give it a whirl. Print out the stamps. Stop going to the post office. Stamps.com. And speaking of mailing it in, let's get back to Chris Webber and his Washington Bullets years. Joe House is on the line. He's lived in Chocolate City since college and was there for the entire C-Web run. We just heard the rational take on Chris Webber's career from Zach Lowe. And now get ready for the irrational take, because Joe House still harboring a lot of bitterness over those mid-90s Bullets teams. House,
wait a minute. We're going to talk about Chris Webber. I thought you were calling me to talk about the record-setting Washington semi-professional football team. That is, they set records every week.
What are the records?
Defensive failure records. The Green Bay Packers last week, for the first time in their history, and I think they've been in the NFL since 1660, had a combination of a 400-yard passer and 100-yard rusher for the first time ever in the history of that team. that combo was achieved against the Washington semi-professional football team last week.
Didn't Rodgers do something like most yards, but also having 4 touchdowns, or was that the week before? Rodgers is up to
no, it had to have been against Washington, 482 plus 4.
Yeah, I think that was like one of the only times that's ever happened.
Anyway.
No, wait, I wanted to talk about the Washington professional football team really fast.
Okay.
Normally I'm not on board with the talk radio embrace debate when they try to grab on the angles and make a big deal out of them. But I'm on board with the Robert Griffin's throwing motion doesn't look the same since he blew out his knee 9 months ago argument. It doesn't look the same. He doesn't look like he plants his leg when he throws.
Right. None of his parts look the same.
No.
This is that the team clearly, the franchise made a deliberate decision. They said, it's so important to us, he's so important to us, that we are willing to sacrifice the first 4 games of the season. We're going to let him get up to speed. We're going to use these real games as his preseason because that's how important he is to the franchise. And, if we end up 0-4 at the end of it, then that's just the way it's going to be.
So you agree with that?
I kind of actually see both sides to it. I don't think it's crazy. I don't think unless he was not 100% in terms of his legs being back under him, then I would want him to not be playing. That would be the case I would make for Cousins, which is, there's still an injury risk kind of embedded in there in those legs because, he's not up to full strength and full speed. But he's moving around. He's definitely hampered and limited, and the brace can't help anything. It was big news here in Washington. Pierre Garçon said he's not as fast. Griffin's not as fast so far this year as at any point last year, which, it's almost clear to the naked eye. But on the other hand, it's clear that this team was not built for a Super Bowl run on the defensive side of the ball. So what the hell? Let him get up to game speed by playing in the games.
Well, you could go the other way and just try to tank the season and get as high of a draft pick as possible. Oh, wait, you don't have one.
Wait, we might have a draft pick next year. I don't remember anymore.
You don't have a first rounder. You gave away 3 in a row for RG 3.1.
Damn it.
Chris Webber, Hall of Famer?
I mean, so let me start with 2 caveats. The first one is I love Zach Lowe. I love his writing. I love his take. It's a very fresh take. He's always extremely thorough. The other caveat, I love Chris Webber. I love his game. He was really a unique talent, and I really, really loved him at Michigan. I love everything about kind of the iconic aspect of him personally and the style of play that he brought and the whole Michigan kind of vibe. But are you crazy? I mean, are you kidding me? Chris Webber? So look, here's the thing about Zach's article. On the one hand, I'll just put it this way. I can't tell whether it's an advocacy piece or an indictment because Zach, in his own inimitable way, lays out the case and lays out all the counterpoints. To me, all of the counterpoints that he makes are exactly the reason why he'll never get in, and that he doesn't deserve to be in.
That's what we just talked about. That
a worse shooter in the playoffs. He shot less in the playoffs. His usage rate was down in the playoffs, and his comp is Elton Brand. No offense, Elton, but he ain't getting in the Hall of Fame, and neither is Chris Webber.
You're concerned about Chris's on and off the court behavior when he played for your beloved Washington Bullets.
I'm not sure that he showed up for every single game ready
in the proper
to play.
Condition to play. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure that he had his head on straight, that he was clear-minded, that his response time, his mental acuity was all the way 100% ready for primetime NBA basketball.
Didn't that put him in common with everyone else in the league in the mid-'90s, though?
It's an interesting case. That might be something worth looking at.
You ended up trading him for Otis Thorpe and Mitch Richmond.
Oh.
And you and I were friends at the time because we've been friends for the last 25 years. You were upset. I was upset. I was upset for you. I was upset just in principle. It was kind of unconscionable.
Yeah, the team at the time, the franchise at the time, was in this habit of quitting on guys in a really weird and irrational way. I mean, they traded Rasheed Wallace, who
after a year,
right? They traded Ben Wallace for Ike Austin. I mean, an all-timer, right? Like in terms of incompetence and really dereliction of duty.
Yeah, and then they traded Chris Webber for Mitch Richmond, who was on the tail end of his run. Fair to say?
But you should look at his stats the first year he was here in Washington. Tail end of his run, that tail had some funny stuff coming out of it. Let me put it that way.
19
it was not
points
a refreshing tail.
He was 33 that year. The first year you got him, he was 33.
Hooray!
God, that trade, I think, would have killed the internet. I think the internet actually would have self-combusted for about 10 minutes. He played at age 33 was 19.7 points a game, but playing 40 minutes a game. And then the next year,
so he had one semi-credible year.
Then the next year he was 17.4 points a game.
Yeah.
So you got 2 years out of him, and then he ended up on the late. Oh, you got 3? I didn't realize there was a third year. I didn't realize he also had 17.7 points a game the next year. So look, anytime you can trade.
This way. I don't think that I'm misremembering. There was an impact on the team. The team was not as good with Mitch Richmond.
No, listen, you were above 500 in C-Web's last 2 years. The first year of the trade with Mitch Richmond, you went 18-32.
Yeah.
So that was a problem.
That's a problem.
The next year you went 29-53. And then the next year you went 19-63. But the good news is you landed the first pick and you were able to take Kwame Brown. And then the next year, Jordan. Michael came back and you were in the 37 win range.
Yeah,
so,
right. Anyway.
Meanwhile, C-Web was a top 5 to top 10 player for his first 5 years at Sacramento.
Well, this is
that trade was a disaster.
It goes to the heart of the dysfunction that I'm mentioning, which is it was a franchise that I think looked itself in the mirror and said, we don't have a game plan for dealing with young talent. We don't have a way for taking these young guys and trying to put them in the system and impressing upon them how important it is to be a professional. And, Washington's not alone in that. There's a lot of teams out there that had the same tough struggle. And Zach touched on that a little bit in his follow-up column today. The idea that the players were kind of out of control and they were being villainized by the press. And, it was an era in the NBA where the character of the players was being attacked. But as much as anything, it's an indictment of the franchises for bringing in kids that they weren't prepared to train how to be professionals and get the most out of them. And Washington was one of the very worst at that.
So the year before, this actually might have to work against C-Web's Hall of Fame case. Zach and I talked about how good that Warriors team was on that he was on. It was a 50-win team and had Tim Hardaway coming back. And Webber didn't want to play center. But meanwhile, Nelson wanted him to be a small ball center because he had Tim Hardaway, Chris Bowen, Billy Owens, and Latrell Sprewell, who just made first team All-NBA.
Wow.
So, yeah. Hey, Chris, it's a good idea that you play center in that team. We're going to run up and down. It's going to be really a lot of fun. Like, just suck it up. But he didn't want to do that. It's not even
like the suck it up part. It's all of the sort of basic, like, management labor kind of concepts. You got to work with him, convince him, make the case to him.
Don Nelson, grumpiest coach of all time.
I understand.
It was a marriage made in hell.
Yeah, that's right.
So C-Web okays this deal to the Washington Bullets. Now, you had finished the year before, you were 24-58. So right off the bat, he loses 26 wins from the previous year. He goes to this team. His buddy Juwan Howard's there. Cal Chaney is there. Scott Skiles, Rex Chapman, and he finally got to play with the center. Unfortunately, the center had a growth deficiency, George Mearson.
Well, growth
hormone deficiency.
It wasn't in full force when C-Webb arrived.
Oh, my apologies. You had a second center, Kevin Duckworth.
Oh, gosh. R.I.P. Kevin Duckworth.
R.I.P. Kevin Duckworth, right.
R.I.P. Kevin Duckworth.
So that's the team he decided to go to because he wanted to play with Juwan Howard, who was good at the time, and Cal Chaney, and Rex Chapman, and Scott Skiles.
Yeah, I don't think it's working in favor of his Hall of Fame case. So give me the high points of Zach's case.
Well, the 5-year peak is basically...
Yeah.
And I agree with that. The 5-year peak is he was every bit on the level of KG and maybe slightly behind Duncan.
Yeah, he was a transcendent talent.
He was the third best power forward in a league that was loaded at power forward for 5 solid years. And then him and Dirk became an argument near the tail end of that.
Yeah, and I mean, there are guys in the Hall that never played in the finals.
And then if he gets one break in 2002, they win the title. Whether it's Horry's, the rebound that doesn't lead to Horry's 3, somebody in the Kings gets it. They're up 3-1. If the officials don't put on WWE hats in the fourth quarter of Game 6, maybe he gets there. If Peja doesn't, I think he airballed the game-winning 3.
Right.
And a year later, Peja was money. He just wasn't ready for the moment yet. And then Doug Christie ended up killing him. I forget what order that was, but those, as I said to Zach, like that was kind of a microcosm of that team.
That's right.
The 2 biggest shots of their season were taken by a not ready yet Peja Stack and making Doug Christie who couldn't shoot. That's a problem.
That's an issue.
But
hurts the case.
But I think they gave the Lakers everything they could handle in that series.
Wow. So is that a Hall of Fame resume?
No, I'm just
played
a
on
5-year
a great team
peak.
that gave a dynasty all they could handle.
5-year peak. Really a memorable, great college career, except for the part that every win was vacated. And the most talented power forward ever, probably. I think from pure talent, he's probably number 1.
Talent.
Got hurt in Sacramento. Unfair. That could happen to Duncan.
Yep. Except it didn't.
And was even at his worst was a guaranteed 2010.
That's right.
So that's the case.
Just never played in the finals. Yeah, I know. It's not fair to take the shots. I get the case. And one does forget. It was great to have it in black and white the way Zach laid it out. He was an awesome passer. It was such a thing that made me enjoy him.
Yeah.
And the stats completely bear it out. They really validate that assist rate and how effective he was, even to the naked eye, because we were just naked guy eyes back then. Naked eye guys.
I don't think we had league pass then. I don't think I got league pass until 0-0. The year after the strike year.
I didn't have it
and I didn't have it the strike year, and they weren't on TV because the Kings were terrible. So there was like this weird underground buzz building with the Kings. Remember, like there was email and there was some internet back then, but there were no videos. There was no way to really see what was going on other than the Sports Center highlights.
Yeah, I'm reading stories about Jason Williams.
Yeah. And maybe like I forget what Sports Center anchor got all fired up about white chocolate, but somebody was all of a sudden white chocolate became a thing, and it became a thing that the Kings were fun, but we had no hardcore evidence. And I remember that year I saw them play in March because we had our annual Vegas March Madness trip, and then I stuck around and we went to a Kings Warriors game.
Oh, cool!
And the Warriors fans booed C-Webb for the entire game, like really with a lot of hate and lust in the booing, and it was awesome. And the Kings were so much fun to watch, and I was so mad that they weren't on TV more. And I remember that year they ended up playing Utah in the best of 5.
Yeah.
And that's when you and I jumped on the bandwagon full force because those games were on. Yeah. And they barely lost. I think Stockton ended up just ripping their hearts out a couple times. But
there was an element to him where You always wanted him to be that good. At least I did, because of how much I enjoyed him in college and how kind of he changed the game. That whole Michigan team changed the game, but him in particular, I always thought, oh man, this guy, when he gets to the pros, if it ever clicks for him, and it really clicked that year that you're describing, and it was like, wow, I was a fan.
Yeah, and he might have been in a situation where he just didn't have the right teammates those first 6 years, because you look at who were on those Bullets teams, and I guess Strickland knew how to play. It's
50-50 who was to blame for the lack of success there.
Would Wes Unseld get any blame?
Of course he would.
Okay.
Get a fair dose of it.
So if you had to rank these guys for Hall of Famers, C-Webb, T-Mac, Vince, how would you rank them?
T-Mac, which is to say in, Vince and C-Webb tie out.
Well, you have Vince tied with C-Webb.
I mean, Vince had some unbelievable playoff games, too.
I have C-Webb way ahead of Vince.
You have C-Webb way ahead of Vince. Vince played in a material number of postseason games, and his postseason numbers are decent.
The best case for Vince is the All-Star games.
So that's a contribution to the game. The Hall isn't exclusively tied to any one factor.
Made 8 straight All-Star games. You
can't just dismiss the dunk stuff.
No, that's the second best case. Is how exciting he was.
Yeah.
And then he in 01 when they gave the Sixers the famous 7-game series, he made second team All-NBA during a really good year for talent for that league.
How many times did C-Webb make first team All-NBA?
Just once in 01.
Right.
Which was impressive because you had Duncan and Garnett there.
Yeah.
So Vince in 01 made second All-NBA. You had Iverson and Kidd, both were great that year. Iverson won the MVP.
Yeah.
Kobe had a monster season on the Lakers. That was his first great Lakers season. And then Ray Allen had probably his best Bucks season that year, I think.
Wow.
And Peyton was still throwing fastballs. So that's Vince getting second team is impressive. Working against him, quitting on Toronto and the entire city and the franchise, that's an issue.
Well, that's an issue for Chris, too.
The fact that he probably spent an entire season just writhing on the ground.
I think Chris may have spent some seasons doing things also.
It's a shame they never played together. Did they play together? No.
I don't think
that would have been quite a combo.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, look, I got to bounce out of here.
Go.
But you have my vote, and I think I know which way you lean on this. Did you indicate to Zach where you were on all this?
I need clarification on the college, because in a vacuum, the college pushes him over the top for me, and he's a Hall of Famer.
Wow.
And also, if you look at some of the guys that are in the Hall of Fame, it's really hard for me to believe he's not a Hall of Famer. But
I understand.
If the college, Zach brought up a great point in his column, if the college works against Chris Webber, and you say, they had to vacate all those wins, and we have to pretend that never happened. And
no,
listen, that was the conclusion the NCAA reached. They vacated every win, so that team never won a game. Historically, there's no record.
That's a clown point, bro.
It's not a clown point, bro.
It's a clown point. You're talking about a clown organization. The NCAA.
I know. Well, that's all understood. But I'm saying,
come on, man. Is that still around? Come on, man.
Come on, man. If the Hall of Fame, I'm saying, if that becomes a penalty in their eyes, then I think that hurts him.
It's not a penalty.
I look at it the other way. I think, to me, that's one of the great college teams ever. Unforgettable. He was unbelievable those 2 years, and I think that should help his case. So I think he is a Hall of Famer when you throw in the Michigan.
Okay. It's not going to hurt my feelings if he makes the Hall of Fame. I just think, the playoff stuff just wasn't up for it. Doesn't make him terrible. He just wasn't up for it.
Well, his 02 was probably the sweet spot for him. He had good numbers in 02.
Okay.
Yeah.
He didn't play in the finals that year.
Joe House, always a pleasure. Good luck with Robert Garbage Time III.
Over and out.
So I get to sign off. Whoa.
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at Podcenter at ESPNradio.com.
Peace out.
Geico presents Strange Saving Stories. Astronomers detected an interstellar transmission. It stated, Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more. The implications were staggering. Was the cosmos telling us we could all save hundreds on car insurance with Geico? Or did their radar merely pick up a signal from the nearby Rufus and Clyde's morning show? We may never know.
Geico, 15 minutes could save you 15% or more on car insurance.